So first, let's just talk briefly about what public engagement actually is. As an environmental educator, it's likely you do quite a bit of public engagement, often in terms of providing the public with information for any number of reasons. You might be interested in educating the public. You might be interested in marketing or influencing stewardship or conservation behaviors or promoting environmental literacy. Now, another form of public engagement actually involves soliciting input from the public. When we think about it in that way, it's more of a two-way interaction rather than us as experts providing something to the public. So, what is that one factor that tends to drive outcomes in public engagement processes? I can tell you from my research and research of colleagues and others in the field who've been studying this for quite some time, that the one factor that tends to drive behavior in these situations more than any other is trust. So next, our big question becomes, well, what's trust and how does it come about? Well, the most common definition of trust is the willingness to accept vulnerability in the face of uncertainty. So I'd like you to think about it for yourself here for a minute, and if you need to pause me, go ahead. Why do you trust? What is it that allows you to accept vulnerability in the face of uncertainty in a variety of situations? What I'd like to share with you is kind of the big idea of this whole presentation, is that trust emerges from more than one place, and different types of trust might actually serve different purposes. So I'm going to tell you about 4 different forms of trust, and then I'd like you to think about them in terms of how to do public engagement. So the first form of trust is called dispositional trust. And you can probably think about people that you know. Some are just generally very trusting people. Others are very skeptical, and it's very difficult to get them to trust somebody else. There's not much we can do about this form of trust as a communicator or an educator, except to know what the baseline of our audience might be. So if we're working in a national park and we're dealing with park visitors who are all there because they love the place they're visiting, we might be able to assume some level of dispositional trust. However, if we're in a public planning process, we might be faced with a quite different audience. And in fact, research suggests that people who show up to public engagement processes to make comments typically start from a much lower baseline of trust than others. This makes sense if we think about it. If I completely trust you to make decisions for me, why would I show up in the first place? Now, as educators, communicators, or facilitators of public engagement processes, we actually have quite a bit more influence over the other 3 types of trust I'm about to mention. The first one I'll talk about, we call rational trust. And rational trust is basically based upon evaluating what we think will be the likely outcome of someone else's behavior. So it's typically based on perceptions of consistent performance, predictability, keeping promises, and being good at what we do. The next type of trust we refer to as affinitive trust, in that it results from an affinity between people. Now, that type of trust can emerge from a number of different places, but generally involves some assumptions of some forms of similarity between the trustee and the truster. Typically assumptions about similar values. So how does this come about? Well, it can come about through sharing positive social experiences, or somebody perceiving that you're a caring person or an active listener. The fourth and final type of trust I'll mention is procedural trust, which we can often refer to as systems-based trust as well. Now, this is trust not so much in a person or an organization, but trust in a set of procedures or system that can protect us, such that interpersonal trust might not be as important. So we can think about this in terms of contracts or rules. Now, when we think that way, contracts and rules can have positive effects on other forms of trust or negative effects. So in positive systems like this, we generally see joint development of those rules, where we all come together and decide that these rules are fair. Therefore, they're transparent as well, such that decision-making rules are clear and open to everybody. They're equitable. And there may be some ability to renegotiate them if somebody notices something that feels unfair. In those cases, in those types of systems, we see the other forms of trust able to develop more easily. Rational and affinitive trust, that is. In some systems that are more coercive or binding, we don't see those other forms of trust develop. So I want you to think about why that matters. Well, here's why it matters. I'd like you to think of these three forms of trust as components of an ecosystem that are interdependent upon each other. And as the ecosystem is stressed or disturbance comes, these three forms of trust can form resilience. For example, let's say you're involved in a collaboration held together primarily by one very charismatic person who everyone trusts. What happens when there's turnover in that position and that person is gone? Well, if we have strong procedures to keep us moving and to keep our system in place, we can weather that storm well while we rebuild interpersonal trust. If we have a performance failure, that's a failure in rational trust where somebody doesn't do their job the way they should have. Well, if we have strong affinitive trust in the system, well, we could probably weather that storm pretty well. If procedures change, which happens all the time, or the system changes on us, if we have strong forms of interpersonal trust, we're probably going to be okay as we respond. And what we've been seeing in our preliminary research is that systems that have all three of these forms of trust at an adequate level, that is procedural, rational, and affinitive trust, tend to do well over longer periods of time. So my challenge to you in thinking about public engagement, no matter what form it is, education, collaboration, or public involvement process, is to really think about it through the lens of these forms of trust. Can you work on building all three to make your collaboration or your engagement more resilient?